He's been linked to 25 shootings, around 14 deaths, and yet he was a loving family man. But if you weren't family, put on your bulletproof vest.
He would torture and torment his wife, his mother, his family members.
They established themselves with the aid of corrupt police in New South Wales to the point where they were completely untouchable.
This is the story of Lenny McPherson, Mr. Big. And Stan the Man Smith. Two Sydney boys who were sent to reform schools as petty crooks and emerged as ruthless gangsters. They rose to the top of organised crime in Sydney and remained there for 3 decades.
Why do people refer to you as Mr. Big?
Oh, I don't know why. Look, fair dinkum, I really don't know why they'd say that.
In this episode of Suburban Gangsters, we explore the rise of Mr. Big, Lenny McPherson, to the head of organised crime in Sydney, and his protege, Stan Smith, as his loyal enforcer. Their rise to power was the direct result of the era they operated in. A time when Sydney was rampant with police corruption.
Historically, organised crime really emerged in Sydney in the late 1920s and the early 1930s. We'd always had some forms of crime, gangs, push gangs before that. But in the 1930s emerged what were called the razor gangs.
The razor gangs ran illegal gambling, prostitution, sly grog and cocaine from the late 1920s through to the mid-1940s. After World War II, a criminal by the name of Frederick Paddles Anderson rose to eminence with a new vision for running vice in Sydney.
Frederick Paddles Anderson was the architect of organised crime in Australia. Anderson had looked at the structure of organised crime in the United States, essentially through the Mafia, and believed that with some changes, it could work here.
I think we can settle everything right here, right now.
The plan was to basically run everything, run every illicit racket, prostitution, gaming, sly grog, and bring it all under one organisation with one man at the top and a number of people running each of these rackets directly below them.
Paddle's protege was a ruthless standover man called Lenny McPherson.
He was the man for the transition in Sydney of racketeering from the old days of organised crime to modern organised crime. We in Sydney had in those days friendly Freds running SPs in barber shops and hotels. In came syndicated SPs. Out went backstreet baccarat and in came the shopfront casinos. Alongside them, out went the laneway prostitution, in came the massage parlours. The whole game of Sydney changed.
The man who would one day become Mr. Big was born Leonard Arthur McPherson in 1921. He was the 10th child of a poor family living in the working-class suburb of Balmain, the nursery for Sydney's best crooks. Lenny was a handful from his earliest days, and by the age of 11, he'd racked up a string of offences for thieving. He wound up in Gosford Boys' Home, a notorious institution where violence and abuse were used to rehabilitate children.
Len McPherson made no secret of the fact that he was physically and sexually abused during his time at Gosford Boys Home. As to what impact that had on his life in future is anybody's guess. But certainly it made him a ruthless man and a violent man.
Few jobs were available to young offenders, so when he returned home, he went to work on the Balmain docks. The docks was a hotbed of crime and villainy, and the perfect school in which to complete his criminal education. Unfortunately for Lenny, he was a terrible student.
In his late teens and early 20s, Len McPherson was a terrible crook. He was always getting pinched for these things. The police would know where to look if a car went missing, if a warehouse was broken into. They would come and look for Len McPherson.
Lenny was caught several times by one of Sydney's most influential cops of the day, Detective Ray Kelly. Kelly seized the opportunity to exploit Lenny's failings as a crook and turned him into a police informant. Lenny acquiesced. He understood that to thrive in Sydney's underworld, he would need the help of the police.
The quality of the information that McPherson was able to provide Kelly made Kelly a hero within the police force. And in turn, the quid pro quo to that was, I will turn a blind eye to your many and manifest crimes, Len.
Kelly wasn't the only cop to call on Lenny for intel. Before Roger Rogerson was sent to prison for murder, he talked to us about working as a policeman on the streets that Lenny and Stan controlled.
I got to know Lenny McPherson well myself later in time. And, you know, he could always go to Lenny if you were working on something and you were trying to put the pieces together. By going to Lenny, I would be able to put a couple of pieces here in place. If I asked Lenny for a favour, call that a favour. It's police work, it's investigating work, but that's how you do it. You ask him for a favour. And of course, if he wanted a favour done, then I would try and help him.
Hi, fellas.
Okay, got yours ready.
Thanks, Chip. It looks like business is picking up.
Doing the police favours was necessary for Lenny's survival. But to command respect and succeed as Mr. Big in the criminal underworld, Lenny needed an enforcer. A ruthless standover man prepared to do what others wouldn't. And he found himself the very best, Stan Smith. While Lenny McPherson was bashing and extorting his way through Sydney's brothels and casinos, another Balmain crook, Stanley John Smith, was saying "I do" to the love of his life.
He remained involved in a loving relationship with his wife for his entire life, kept his children away from a life of crime, but he was prepared to get his hands dirty to set that situation up.
That same year, Stan met his second life partner, Mr. Big himself. Lenny was impressed by the man, 15 years his junior, and they became lifelong friends.
Smith had a very significant record. I think he ended up with something like about 30 or 35 entries from those early days. What is interesting is that even though he was a very rough, tough guy, he was not well connected, but he still seemed to manage to beat most of the charges. So I think that is something, his toughness, his ruthfulness, And his ability to beat charges was something that McPherson himself would have liked. They both saw themselves as Balmain boys who did it tough.
The two men were cut from the same cloth. Both were born into poverty on the hard streets of Balmain. To them, school was a waste of time. Their education came at the feet of older crims and thugs. Lenny and Stan spent their teenage years in and out of boys' homes. Stan endured the dark terrors of Gosford Boys' Home and Tamworth Institution for Boys, and emerged with a set of skills and the confidence to use them. Stan developed a fearsome reputation as an enforcer and became an asset to Lenny in his ambitions to run racketeering in Sydney. This fearsome duo became a trio when Lenny's prison mate George Freeman joined the firm. They were known as the Team, and each player had their role.
Freeman is a bookmaker. Freeman makes his money by fixing races, bribing jockeys, making a lot of money for people by fixing the races and then telling the people in positions of power, I fixed the race, put your money on number 3 at Rose Hill. McPherson is an old-style 1950s, 60s gangster. His job is racketeering, nightclubs, prostitution, brothels, the sins that everyone can accept. Stan is a school prefect. His job is to keep everything in line.
The Team's early income came from extorting money from illegal brothels.
While Stan was married to his wife for a lifetime, he was known to be extremely violent towards other women, particularly prostitutes. There are stories of him hanging women out from windows, terribly violent, to the point where it became an embarrassment to Lenny McPherson. Lenny would have to go around and pay these girls off, pay their medical expenses.
Domestic violence against women was endemic in many working-class homes of Balmain in those days. Terrorising women came easily to Lenny, as his wife would soon experience firsthand.
In the 1960s, anybody who challenged Len McPherson would end up dead. And this is all about grabbing power and holding power.
Paddles Anderson had taught Lenny that anyone who didn't comply or threatened their enterprises had to go. Lenny obliged and is believed to have been responsible for 10 murders during the 1960s. But murder isn't good for business, unless, that is, you've got police protection.
Thanks, Chip.
In the heyday of Lenny's reign, you might say, as number one Mr. Big in Sydney, Sydney was a strange place. Sydney was not at all like Melbourne in terms of the relationship between police and crims. In Sydney, the crims were like big-time celebrities, like the Kardashians, and the police acted as their agents, so that every step of the way, be it bail or arrest or a lighter sentence or let go, the police were paid. They had their hands out waiting to be paid. Some police even became more entrepreneurial, so some of them were production managers of the crimes.
Lenny's relationship with Detective Ray Kelly gave him a reliable force field of protection. Kelly not only kept Lenny out of jail for his organised crime activities, he also looked after Lenny on the domestic front. In 1960, Lenny returned home after a short stint in jail on a murder charge that was mysteriously dropped. But despite his lucky escape from justice, there was no relief for his wife.
Lenny McPherson was an absolute misogynist and woman hater, woman beater. He had bashed his wife from when they were married in the 1940s, and he would often come home or get out of, remand or something, and come home drunk and jealous, poor Lenny, and would bash his wife. One time he came home, dinner wasn't on the table, and he shot up the whole kitchen, including the food cooking on the stove. Another time, it was even worse. He bashed her, then he allegedly tied one of her legs to a tree in the garden and tied the other end of the rope to his car and threatened to pull her apart. Now, at that stage, the long-suffering Joy had had it, and she decided she'd press charges for attempted murder. But along comes Detective Ray Kelly, who manages to smooth things over and mediate a separation agreement between Joy and McPherson.
Lenny's wife had a reprieve, but the same couldn't be said for a man named Robert James Pretty Boy Walker.
Pretty Boy Walker was another bludger, and he'd commenced basically trying to take over some of Len McPherson's brothel territory.
Walker had bashed Stan for assaulting a prostitute. Some days later, Stan went to Walker's house to sort him out. But Walker had a gun and opened fire, wounding Stan in the chest. Retribution would be swift.
And Len McPherson took the opportunity of his marriage to his second wife, used that as an alibi so he and Stan Smith could go and pursue Pretty Boy Walker and kill him. Len McPherson goes through the ceremony, gets married, says to the wife, "Sorry, darling, I've just got to duck out for a few minutes, got a bit of business on." He and Stan Smith go to where they believe Walker was. They proceed down Allison Road, Randwick, and there's Pretty Boy Walker walking down the street. McPherson's ready for him, and he sticks a machine gun out the window and blows him away.
The fact that Detective Ray Kelly was the lead investigator meant that Lenny was never in the frame, as attested by Roger Rogerson.
I was sent out to Randwick to work on the murder of a guy named Pretty Boy Robert Walker. We were told, as Detective Inspector Kelly would be getting the information from Lenny, and for some reason that information didn't materialise. And to this day, the crime is still unsolved. I was a very junior bloke. As I said, these guys were inspectors and senior sergeants, and it wasn't for me to tell them what to do, but it was just an experience for me to watch the way they worked, and I gained valuable experience from it.
Walker wasn't Lenny's only rival to meet an early end. One by one they fell, many believe at the hand of Stan the Man Smith. Standover men Charlie Burke and Robert Steele both met untimely ends after they sought to take control of some of the team's standover rackets. A brothel owner, Joe Borg, was killed with a car bomb, which cemented McPherson's hold on the prostitution industry and the extortion rackets that went with it. Neither Stan nor Lenny were implicated in these crimes, some say courtesy of their relationship with Detective Ray Kelly. But police protection doesn't come for free.
It's 8 o'clock on the 19th of December. Here are the headlines. Ronald Ryan and Peter Walker have escaped from Melbourne's Pentridge Prison. During the escape, a guard was shot dead. As the Victoria Police closed in, it is believed that they have fled to Sydney.
if criminals came to Sydney and they wanted some sort of protection themselves, they'd go and see Lenny. Well, when two criminals from Melbourne came up here, they went to see Lenny, and of course one of them was Ronald Ryan.
Ryan and Walker escaped from Pentridge, and of course the heat was on them, on Sydney, to bring about their arrest. Information was that they were here, and Lenny McPherson played a big part, of course, in bringing about their successful arrests.
Ronald Ryan had sought Lenny's help in getting out of the country. Lenny agreed and arranged a meeting in Sydney.
So Lenny told Kelly. Kelly went out and arrested them. And of course they were extradited back to Melbourne. Kelly was made a hero, and Ronald Ryan became the last man hanged in Australia. Lenny wasn't publicly given the credit, but that's the sort of thing he did do.
Lenny's information was so valuable to police that in 1967 he got away with murdering a man right in front of two cops. The victim was a hitman, Raymond Ducky O'Connor, he'd been feuding with. He asked O'Connor to meet him in the Latin Quarter nightclub to discuss a truce.
McPherson, my understanding is, was unarmed, but his henchmen weren't. The lights went out for no more than a minute.
Suddenly, shots rang out, and of course Ducky O'Connor was found on the floor dead. Some would say it was murder, foul play. I really believe it was probably justifiable homicide. Would be the best description to cover it, and no one was ever charged over it.
At the end of the 1960s, the team had consolidated their hold on Sydney's rorts. Most of their competitors were dead or had fallen into line. It had taken a lot of blood and corruption to get there, but a status quo had been achieved. And everyone knew the rules. Lenny McPherson's ambitions to create a Mafia-style crime syndicate on Australia's eastern seaboard really took off when he was befriended by a rising star in the American Mafia, Joe Testa. Stan Smith had already won favour with Testa on a trip to Chicago in the mid-60s.
One night there was a big party there, and a rival of Testa's arrived on the scene, and it started to get ugly, and to the point where this rival punched Joe. Stan Smith launched himself at this guy and bit his nose off and spat it out in the ground. And Testa just could not believe, this was not even his fight. This was protecting Joe. Therefore, Joe could trust these people. And this started a long-term relationship between them.
Joe Testa came to Australia several times to explore business opportunities. But the criminal landscape was too unfamiliar.
To come to Australia, which was controlled by a group of criminals and corrupt police, was very foreign to them.
Then they looked at the style of McPherson, they looked at the style of Smith, they knew that they were violent, bestial men when it suited them, who would not hesitate to shoot any intruders, whether they were Mafia aligned or not, and the Mafia gently declined and returned to America, thinking it wasn't really worth that, which gives you some idea of the quality of brutality that existed in Australian crime at the time, where life was unbelievably cheap, and as soon as you looked around, there was someone prepared to shoot you for whatever reason, no matter how minor.
It was around this time the mentor-protege relationship between Lenny and Stan began to change. This was picked up on phone taps, monitored by former New South Wales Assistant Police Commissioner Jeff Schuberg.
And they started off just talking quite normally, and they used to converse 2 or 3 times a day. And he was telling McPherson about the problem he's been having with his colon. And Lenny was telling him about how he'd make a point every morning of getting up and having a shit before I do anything else through the day. Stan agrees with him and says, yeah, it's important to have a fucking shit every day to clean your colon out. And then Lenny said something along the lines of, yeah, look, that's right, Stan. He said, Stan? He said, you call me Stan on the phone. How many times have I got to fucking tell you, you fucking dog, you imbecile? Don't call me that on the telephone. And he slammed the phone down. And because we're sitting back listening to this conversation, pissing ourselves laughing, you know, it was just so funny. And it gave an insight into these 2 individuals. After about 5 minutes, Stan rings Lenny back. Listen, I'm sorry, mate. Sorry about the way I spoke to you. That's okay, Stan. There you fucking go again, you fucking idiot. You fucking imbecile, you stupid cunt. Bang, the phone would go down again. This took place on a daily basis. Stan would have regular conversations with Lenny. Stan didn't have a lot of conversations with George. Most of the information went through Lenny to George. And I think the reason for that was that George Freeman was paranoid about this reputation that Stan had for his involvement in drugs.
Stan had seen a future in the cannabis industry. It had given him some independence and a chance to build his own criminal organisation, separate to the team.
Freeman and McPherson made a very conscious decision in those early 70s not to get involved in the drug trade or even the cannabis trade because they saw it as creating problems. They didn't believe the police would accept it and they didn't believe the politicians would accept it. If they ran and dealt only with what you'd call victimless crimes, such as gambling, the casinos and so on, they believed no one was getting hurt, the community wanted it, and the politicians wouldn't pay too much attention and they could make good money without trouble.
Smith used his connections to import huge quantities of marijuana.
He became the biggest distributor of marijuana Australia had at the time. But with Smith having more assets than to protect, he was a major drug distributor and he needed to protect that, which led him to more and more violence as life went on because there were always people coming in trying to get a piece of the action, so the murder toll just rose.
He remained heavily involved in the drug trade, and yet he spent just 3 months behind bars in his entire life. The force field of police protection that surrounded Lenny continued to encompass Stan.
Now, as the more Smith became involved in the sale and distribution of cannabis, the less he saw of McPherson and Freeman, but no one should be in any doubt. If he was ever called upon by them to assist, he went to their aid, the same as they would go to his. It was their survival.
That call came in 1974. A psychopath named John Stuart Regan was wreaking havoc in the underworld. He was a pimp, a rapist, a standover man and multiple murderer. He taunted the police and showed no respect for the team or their code.
They did live by a code. I mean, innocent people had nothing really to fear, whereas with John Regan, innocent people had a lot to fear. If he was in your vicinity, you had a lot to fear.
He killed his peers, he killed his rivals, he killed anyone and hurt anyone who got in his way. He became a threat to the very system that Freeman, McPherson and Stan depended on for their livelihood.
But Regan stepped beyond the pale when he was suspected of murdering a toddler he was babysitting for a girlfriend.
When the baby went missing, Regan was clearly the suspect. His violence was well known. There's no doubt he killed the baby. It received a lot of adverse publicity in the media, And from the point of view of Freeman, McPherson, Smith, they were trying to run an operation at that time that was quiet, discreet, out of the way. They were more interested in the money than the publicity. Regan had to go, and his murder was arranged.
He was shot 8 times with bullets from 3 different guns and was left dead in a pool of blood on the street, put down like a mad dog. Many believe that all the members of the team were involved.
I think the killing of Regan was very symbolic in a number of ways. From the point of view of Freeman and McPherson, it was very important that they be known to have committed the murder, that they be known to have solved a problem that was confronting the police, that they had got rid of this nasty person. But at the same time, it was important they didn't get caught or charged with it. So they were happy to be known for it. It also left this message that this is what would happen to people who, if you like, broke the rules that they were trying to impose on crime at that time.
The rumour had always been that Stan Smith was involved. Good on him, as I said before. He should have got a medal.
Stan was known as a man of principle among his criminal peers, and a crook who killed a kid simply had to go. While Stan was a drug trafficker, he drew the line at heroin, the drug that had struck at his own family. 5 years after the killing of Regan, Stan's son died from a heroin overdose, and Stan was hell-bent on revenge. As Stan Smith grew rich from trafficking marijuana, he was also battling his son's addiction to heroin.
Smith had taken very substantial steps to try and get his son off heroin. He put him into rehabilitation. In fact, he'd built what I guess you or I might describe at their Whale Beach home as a jail cell to try and keep control of his son and get him off the heroin. When he got back onto the heroin and died, Smith reacted very violently. There was a drug dealer on the North Shore who was killed in a very violent fashion, and the story is that Smith believed him to be the supplier to his son.
Stan Smith was a very effective executioner. He'd done it for business reasons all his life, to protect the businesses that they had been involved with, the East Coast milieu. It was rarely a crime of passion with Stan. But when his son died of a heroin overdose, it was now personal.
The story, that's never been proven, was that Stan lured the drug dealer to a secluded spot, claiming he wanted to buy some heroin, and then murdered him in cold blood.
He showed no mercy. He was a wild man. He thumped him and bashed him, and then he got his car and he drove forward and back, forward and back, forward and back over the drug dealer to perhaps, you know, get rid of some of the anger and the grief that he had.
Despite his deep mourning, Stan soon returned to his dope business, which was centred in the Byron Bay hinterland of northern New South Wales. However, he returned to Sydney when George and Lenny faced problems from a hitman named Christopher Rentakill Flannery. Flannery was on the team's payroll as a bodyguard, but he'd had ideas above his station and was teaming up with another Sydney crime boss, Neddy Smith.
You then had Flannery and Neddy Smith starting to move around the SP network, where Flannery was making his views known that he wanted to be paid protection money, that he was going to take over the Freeman network.
The final straw came when Flannery shot a serving New South Wales policeman, Michael Drury.
This was a type of crime that was beyond the acceptable behaviour of people like Lenny McPherson and George Freeman, the old-style organised crime figure. They would never interfere in this way with a police officer or families within the community. They would only interfere with other violent criminals. That was the nature of their criminality.
Shooting a policeman is always bad for business, and it raises the spectre of other relationships being exposed, other after effects. And so at the end of the day, I think George Freeman, Lenny McPherson, Stan Smith and others couldn't take the risk on this guy.
It's widely believed that Freeman lured Flannery to his home under a ruse. He had a new machine pistol to give him. Flannery never got to handle the gun, but instead was on the receiving end of its power. The gunman was Stan Smith.
There were a number of similarities, of course, between the murder of John Regan and Chris Flannery. And in particular, I'd point to the fact that both were carried out almost as a civic duty.
Now that I'm out of the police, I can say things like this. I think they did a community service in getting rid of some of those people. Now, if you're a serving police officer, you should never say that, but I can assure you that a lot of police held that view.
With Rentokil gone, peace was restored, but it wouldn't last. The world that created Lenny McPherson and Stan Smith was changing.
Lenny was locked up and charged every 3 months of his life until 1953, when he started informing on his mates. And then after that, well, he didn't get pinched for 40 years.
All along, Lenny would inform on his opposition. He would sometimes even inform on some people who had previously been within his outfit that he wanted to get rid of. But when it came to talking to him, I had to tell, if he was talking to me on the phone, which he used to do from time, he would never say anything at any stage to put himself in. And in fact, he's appeared before various inquiries, including royal commissions. You know, they've had sometimes up to 16 QCs, lawyers, quizzing Lenny. He just played them on a break. He would pop out a few smart remarks, but no one could ever pin him. He wasn't just a rough crook. He was a very smart man.
By the early 1990s, the police protection Lenny had enjoyed for so long began to wane. The coppers he dealt with had either retired or moved on. A new crime-fighting body had been formed, and Lenny was in the crosshairs.
At Central Court, an angry Lenny McPherson criticised the National Crime Authority after being committed to stand trial for an alleged assault.
They spent $5 million, followed me for 2 years, taped me phone for 2 years.
The Sydney identity was granted bail. The trial begins in September.
Without police like Ray Kelly to keep him out of prison, Lenny was vulnerable. In court, he faked having Alzheimer's disease in a desperate attempt to avoid jail. He continued the lie in a television interview.
My wife went to Alzheimer's and learned all about it so she could watch me. And she knows that I am slowly deteriorating. She told me, you don't want to put them through it because you see what I know what's happened to my brothers. They're just nothing. My sister's dead. No one wants to know you.
Are you frightened of going to jail?
Well, not really frightened of going to jail, but I think I'll die there. I think I'll lose my memory there, and that's what I'm frightened of.
Numerous appeals based on Lenny's alleged Alzheimer's failed, and he was sent to Cessnock prison. But even as his influence and physical power waned inside, his violent instincts remained. Former inmate Graham Henry recalls Lenny's time in prison.
I virtually just took him under my wing in the last few years of his life and looked after him. But you know, he didn't really need looking after. I can remember once in the prison system that he was working in the servery, and a little Vietnamese bloke stuck his hand in the servery and wanted more peas put on your plate. Well, you're only allowed one scoop, and you know, if there's any extra, come back later. So he kept on jamming his hand under the thing, so then he pulled his hand in and stuck the fork through his hand.
Lenny had enjoyed great wealth, power and privilege in life, but even Mr. Big couldn't barter his way out of death. In 1996, Lenny died of a heart attack inside Cessnock jail.
I've got to take me out after him. He was there for a long time. They ruled supreme for a long, long time, longer than any other gang.
Mr. Big survived 3 decades at the top, an achievement that owed more to the corruption within Sydney's elite and the New South Wales Police than any attribute that Lenny possessed. His era simply passed into history. As the world changed, Stan Smith began to reflect on his own life of crime. He'd been loyal to the team, but at the expense of his mortal soul. It was time to atone, he believed.
There is no doubt that over the years, Smith was very affected by his son's death as a result of heroin, and perhaps even this general realisation of your own mortality once you start getting into the 60s and 70s particularly.
The extraordinary journey of Smith's life had one more twist to take. In 2003, he found God.
A man called Beaver, he converted Stan Smith to religion. How we got close enough to even broach the subject, we'll never know, but he did. And in his latter years, Stan Smith, the tough man involved with so many murders and so much crime, turned to God.
Well, ever read of the Bible or I'll blow your fucking head off. Well, turn to the Psalms there, or I'll shoot you in the foot. Have a read of Genesis there, or I'll take your left leg off.
The conversion wasn't a jail conversion. This wasn't an attempt to demonstrate remorse to a court. This was, I believe, a genuine metamorphosis from someone who'd been an angry, violent man into someone who started to reflect upon his life's value. And his conversion, for want of a better word, would have been his genuinely held belief that he could do good.
Good morning to everybody. My name is Stanley Smith. I'm 67 years old. I'm very pleased to be baptised, as it means a lot to me. And it shall be a commitment by me to take the Lord, Christ is my Saviour and my running water. But Jesus said, I am the way, the truth and the light. No one goes to the Father except by me.
Stan the Man Smith had been involved in the killing of up to 14 people, but he'd never paid the cost. In 2010, after a life of sin, Stan's turn came to die. He was ready, without a hint of irony or hypocrisy, to stand before his God for judgment.